Welcome so much to this webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Emily Knight. I am the Outreach Manager with the LenFest Ocean Program. For those that don't know us, the LenFest Ocean Program is a grant-making program that funds ocean and coastal research projects and expert working groups to address needs facing decision makers and stakeholders. To learn more, visit us at lenfestocean.org, where you can also sign up for our newsletter and follow us at LenFestOcean on Twitter. In fact, we will be live tweeting this webinar on the hashtag LOP webinar. So feel free to use it, and if you're inclined, engage with us there. So we are really excited to have joining us today Dr. J. Emmett Duffy, Director of the Tenenbaum Marine Observatories Network and Marine Geo Program at the Smithsonian Institute, and Dr. Daniel Dunn, Senior Lecturer, Center for Biodiversity and Conservation Science, School of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Queensland. They will be discussing their new research, which is entitled Marine Biodiversity Dialogue. So you might be asking, why that title? What does that mean? I will let Emmett and Daniel get into the specifics, but we wanted to highlight in the title that the outputs of this project, which will be a spatial gap analysis and a framework by which we can assess marine habitat and biodiversity, will come from just that, dialogue. Dialogue across two expert working groups, the first of which recently started. And through their collaboration, those working groups will wrestle with concepts related to measuring and monitoring marine biodiversity, including discussing case studies from across the world. We'll also have an introduction from Chris Sari, President and CEO of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. The Sanctuary Foundation is our partner in supporting this project, and Chris is very much at the forefront of why this project is so necessary. So finally, this webinar is what we at LenFest like to call a launch webinar. That is a webinar that we provide at the beginning of the project versus the end where there's results. Our goal being to promote transparency and engage audiences from the outset of the project. So on that note, we will continue to share information on the progress of this project via a variety of avenues, which at this point are to be determined. But I've started with creating a running distribution list for everyone interested. If you are not on that or unsure if you are, just send me a note. My email is on the slide. I'm pretty easy to find. Second, we are recording this webinar, and we will distribute the link broadly and hope you will forward it to your networks. A few webinar logistics. We have all attendees muted. With so many people on the line, this is just to prevent feedback or echoes. We will have time for the end for questions. Use the Q&A panel to type and submit your question at any point during the webinar today. We'll keep track of the queue, and I will read the question aloud at the end for the researchers to answer. And if you type it into the chat, that's okay. I will do my best to follow that as well, but we prefer kind of keeping it all in one place in the Q&A panel. Also, we might run out of time for questions. If you submit a question that doesn't end up getting asked, we do download all of them, so we will see your question and can always follow up. And we also welcome you to follow up with us, either at LenFest or the researchers. So at this point, I am going to turn the mic over to Chris, who's going to give an introduction to this project.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you. Thank you for everyone who's joining us this evening. My name is Chris Seri. I'm President and CEO of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. And I want to also thank Lenfest Ocean Program for working with us on this project, and also the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for their support for this effort. So for those of you who don't know the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, we're a nonprofit organization, and we work very closely with NOAA to increase stewardship of our oceans and Great Lakes. And one of the important ways that we do this is we try to increase awareness and support for our essential network of protected waters or national marine sanctuaries and marine national monuments. The rationale behind this project is pretty simple. You know, as humans, we depend on a healthy planet for our livelihood, and a healthy planet depends on a healthy ocean, and a healthy ocean depends upon the variety of life that's supported in it and the habitats that it can maintain. And as we know, we're losing species diversity with harmful consequences for both the environment and humans. And so we wanted to look at undertaking this project with the question of, if you want to have a healthy ocean, what are those key areas that we need to protect for marine biodiversity? And so the idea came to develop a framework that assesses where there's gaps in and to what extent marine protected areas in the US are helping to protect biodiversity from the nearshore to the borders of the US EEZ. And the idea of this framework is ultimately, it becomes a tool that decision makers, natural resource managers, and stakeholders can use at local, regional, and national levels to determine what types and percentages and approaches that we need to take to managing ecosystems. And this is really important as we talk about wanting to protect 30% of nature by 2030. Where we put these areas, the level of protections, all have a tremendous difference in terms of the health of our ocean. So the work that Daniel and Emmett will discuss tonight actually kind of arose almost 20 years ago from an executive order that called on us to do a scientifically based comprehensive national system of MPAs that would represent diverse US ecosystems. And 20 years later, we actually haven't been able to do that. And this is really a start of that effort to look at what is a comprehensive national system of MPAs that represent diverse ecosystems. Because we know right now that we have gaps in representation, we have ecological gaps, and we have management gaps. And so understanding from a science framework about how we can address these gaps from a management and policy perspective is very critical, and especially to national marine sanctuaries and marine national monuments. How do we actually make sure as we look to expand the system and designate new sites that we're really looking at those opportunities that will help increase our biodiversity? So I'm very excited that this is the start of a process where we can look at the scientifically based comprehensive way to look at how do we protect biodiversity in our oceans, and really look at it from both the health of the ocean and also the role that it helps play in terms of the health of human communities too. So thank you, Emily, and I'll turn it over to Emmett and Daniel.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. And Emmett, do you want to launch into the presentation about the project?
Sure. Yes, hi everyone. Let me share my screen here and I'll be right with you. So welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to share our plan for this important project. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, we can.
Sure can.
Okay.
It looks
good.
good.
Just checking. So this is a project that Daniel and I hope everyone involved hopes will provide a foundation for a renewed data-rich approach to marine biodiversity protection. And I'd like to thank the Lenfest Ocean Program and the National Marine Sanctuaries Foundation for supporting this work. So I'd like to begin with the basic question of why we should be protecting biodiversity in the first place. And there are, of course, many reasons for this and many answers that could be given. Nature provides inspiration that can't be valued, but also utilitarian services, fisheries, aquaculture, coastal protection, and so on. And diversity strengthens ecosystems. But despite these benefits, biodiversity is really threatened in many areas around the world by overharvesting and coastal development and pollution, among other threats. So the question is, how do we protect biodiversity in a way that is sustainable into the future, but that is also compatible with the human uses that we have for the ocean? And Chris mentioned that much of this began with, or I should say was formalized with President Clinton's executive order in 2000, which was meant to develop a scientifically based framework for sustaining biodiversity in protected areas. And that led to the development of the NOAA's National MPA Center, which is celebrating its 20th birthday this year, and to the MPA inventory, among other things, which is charged with strengthening and expanding the protected area network and partnering with others as well. So in 2015, the MPA Center produced this framework, and let's see if I can move this. Yeah, okay. Produced this framework for the protected areas, and included several goals for the United States network. These include protecting or conserving and managing natural heritage, what we think of as biodiversity, species, habitats, the processes that happen in them, as well as cultural heritage that is important to humans. And this involves historic sites as well as important areas for cultural identity. And then finally, of course, to ensure sustainable production of fishes and other resources that people use from the ocean by protecting nurseries and foraging areas and larval supply and so on. And there were other objectives as well. So there are a number of reasons, there's now considerable evidence that protected areas benefit biodiversity. From several perspectives. Thinking about it from the fisheries perspective, protected areas generally have more fish, bigger fish, more biomass, and also more species, particularly if they're well enforced, but also have benefits for people in terms of spillover of fish to outside areas as well. So these have been documented well elsewhere, and we won't spend much time on them, except to say that in addition to these fisheries benefits, there are also benefits in many other ways, including recreational opportunities, attractive habitats for tourism, and so on. So this brings us to the question of how to make sure we are protecting what we need, given that there are multiple uses of land and sea. And so in the marine realm, in the ocean, answering this question is really at a pretty early state. And so we can turn to the experience on land to ask, to look for lessons learned on how to optimize protection of biodiversity within the country. And so there are good data on both biodiversity and protection on land, and we have looked at this from a couple of different perspectives. One is to ask, where the biodiversity is. And there are various ways of looking at this, including the species richness, that is the number of species of particular kinds of animals and plants, but also the degree to which they are unique and live only there, the number of endemics. And as you can see, that varies a bit among different groups. And then when that is overlaid on the areas that are protected, the prioritization results in selecting places that are high on the score of having richness and or endemics, but are not currently protected. So this is one way to prioritize protection, or one of the criteria. But we also have to consider how all of those different protected sites might work together in a network. And this is because, particularly in the warming world in which we find ourselves now, organisms move around, and we need to be able to sustain those populations for future generations. And that requires designing the networks in such a way that the organisms will be able to move. So that's the principle of connectivity. There is also the criterion of ecosystem representation. That is, we're interested not only in isolated species, but also in the kinds of ecosystems that they live in. And so ecosystem representation, such as in the lower left map here, is a criterion as well. And again, these are different needs. They need to be balanced to prioritize conservation. This is relatively well done on land, but still poorly known in the ocean. And finally, as I mentioned, for connectivity, an important aspect is preparing for climate change. And so that entails considering aspects of the landscape and land forms that allow organisms to have refuges or refugia from changing climate, and also climate corridors that allow them to move as the climate warms. So this has been done on land and is only beginning in the ocean. So that brings us to the question, after having looked at some of the experience from terrestrial systems, of how our marine protected areas are doing, or how we're doing in protecting biodiversity in the ocean. And I should first emphasize that the United States has nearly 1,000 marine protected areas of one sort or another across our many regions. And in fact, 26% of the US exclusive economic zone is under some form of protection, which sounds great. But it's also true that only 3% of that is in fully protected or no-take MPAs, which science shows are really the best way to protect and sustain biodiversity. And finally, of that protected area, almost half of it is in the remote Pacific Islands, including Hawaii. So there is a fair amount of work to do in reaching the goals that of 30% in the coming decade or so. So in addition to the total amount of area protected, the question also becomes how representative are these protected areas in the United States? And so the good news is that across the network of protected areas in the US, at least 82% of the marine habitat types that are recognized are represented in at least one of the 19 ecoregions in the United States. And somewhere between 70 to 80% of major animal and algal or seaweed ecosystem features are also protected, and many of the processes. Again, though, it's important to point out that many of these are sort of one-off instances, and there are really only 2 of the 19 US ecoregions, coastal ecoregions, that have more than 1% of their area in no-take reserves. And it's also true that the key habitats in many of the species of marine animals in our waters their distributions are poorly known. And finally, as I mentioned, we're really not prepared for climate change as these organisms start to move. So this was part of the rationale for why we need a spatial gap analysis of marine biodiversity. So that brings us to the current project, the Marine Biodiversity Dialogues. And our goal simply is to assess the status of marine biodiversity, both habitats and species, and conservation within the US EEZ through a spatial gap analysis. Again, this goes back to the executive order's charge of developing a scientifically based comprehensive framework. And it's really important to point out that we are keen to make sure that the results of this analysis matter. That is, we want what we find out, the science, to be applied, that is, to inform conservation in the real world, to be feasible and possible within a time-bound framework, working together. So we are looking for consensus and to listen and learn. And to do that, we have convened a very diverse and smart group of people, which we will mention in a few moments, to come to that and to synthesize what has been learned. So what can this project offer that perhaps hasn't been done before? The first is that we're bringing a broad international perspective, looking at what has worked in other places, what hasn't worked, and we also are importantly integrating the biodiversity monitoring perspective that has developed extensively in recent years with the conservation planning framework that is used in many national, regional conservation plans. Finally, it's important to point out that the Marine Biodiversity Dialogues project is primarily about providing the information that will allow an informed solution and informed conservation plans to be made. We are not offering a solution ourselves, but the best information that we hope can inform that. And then finally, over the course of this time, we hope that this will give us a better understanding of some of the risks and pitfalls that we might find on the way. Oops. So this is a roadmap, as it were, of where we're going. And the project is proceeding in two phases. The first, and both of these have working groups of experts with broad expertise. The first is to develop a framework for the spatial gap analysis. And what I mean by that is to think carefully about the kinds of approaches that are going to be needed, the types of biodiversity that are most important and most indicative of the health of the ecosystems on which to concentrate, and then to synthesize that into recommendations for how we then go forward with the second phase, which is the quantitative gap analysis itself. And that phase will take the draft framework that was produced by the first group and really bring the geospatial analysis experts together to assemble available data, analyze that data in a spatially explicit framework, and then develop that into a peer-reviewed manuscript, one or more manuscripts, that are able to quantify the status of marine biodiversity protection in US waters, what is being protected, and how well. So just to come back to the first working group, which is underway right now, we've convened the group and we're starting by studying a number of specific cases of conservation planning and biodiversity monitoring that have been done, and developing that as a group into a practical approach via a consensus process. So these are the participants in the first working group that is underway now. I won't go through the group in detail, except to say that we have both scientists working in the marine realm in various different aspects of oceanography and marine ecology, as well as conservation practitioners. We have people from several places throughout the world with experience in different regions, NGOs as well as academics and government scientists. And we have connections to several of the major biodiversity monitoring programs worldwide and conservation groups. So I mentioned that the first working group's charge is to develop the framework. So again, this is summarizing the information on how biodiversity has been defined and measured in practice by integrating the two complementary approaches. The marine conservation planning we think of as something of a top-down approach, that is coming from a national or regional or even global scale and asking how we create networks of protected areas. And then secondly, coming from the bottom up in the form of programs that have been focused on monitoring and describing biodiversity around the world. So we're looking for the sweet spot where those two meet. And without going into a lot of details about this case study approach, I'll just mention that we have divided our different case studies roughly equally into talks by members of the working group that have done conservation planning on national, state, regional scales, California ML, Marine Life Protected Area, for example, Nature Conservancy's work, comprehensive national levels in Australia and New Zealand, as well as areas beyond national jurisdiction for the larger migratory species especially. And then on the other side, we are hearing from experts on frameworks for marine biodiversity observation at global and regional scales, national scales, national implementation of monitoring programs, and also on particular kinds of habitats and species that figure largely in these programs. So each of these, we have asked each of the speakers in this series to address a standardized set of questions that we hope will allow us to have some continuity across them. Who runs the assessments? What were the goals and objectives? What approaches have been used? Indicators, data, and what lessons have been learned. And the end product for the first working group is to synthesize all of that information into the framework. And in order to make sure that we have accounted for the different aspects that we feel are important, we've organized the group into subgroups to consider the information that we've heard and the lessons learned in terms of thinking about the kinds of frameworks that might be implemented in the United States or that are most effective, what components of biodiversity are most important and feasible to measure, what spatial and biogeographic resolution is needed, how we design the process in the most appropriate way to deal with ongoing climate change, and then finally how we consider networking these together. So with all of that done, the output becomes the Biodiversity Protection Assessment Framework. And this, we anticipate at this stage, could include a general conceptual model for how marine biodiversity might best be assessed, a suite of indicators informed by what we know from current monitoring and planning, and very importantly, a list of potential data sources that the second group will then be able to use in the gap analysis. And with that, we move on to the second working group. And here I'd like to turn the podium, as it were, over to Daniel, who is the expert here. And I think in order to do that, I'm going to...
You're good. I'll just ask you to forward the slide.
Okay, good.
Sorry.
I was wondering if we could hear you or not. Okay, go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, thank you everybody for joining this call. Part of the reason that you are hearing this at 7 p.m. is that I live in Australia. I moved over here last year from the US, where I was working at Duke University, and I now work at the University of Queensland. So I appreciate you all with joining from your after hours. Joining after hours. We've already seen at least one message in the chat from somebody in New Zealand, so I'm sure there are a lot of folks in this side of the world that appreciate the ability to actually participate in this type of webinar. So thank you very much for joining. As Emmett said with the working group 1, these working groups are really an opportunity to bring people together with expertise on these particular matters. And it's, again, it's not myself and Emmett trying to push this forward. It's us trying to convince as many brilliant minds as we can to participate and help us with this. And in particular, working group 2 has not actually been completely formulated yet. There will be some people from working group 1, but I suspect we will be reaching out to some of the folks even on this call to participate in working group 2 actually implement the assessment, which brings me to this slide. So the goal of this is to actually implement a spatial gap analysis of U.S. marine biodiversity protection to apply the framework that is developed by the first working group. And essentially what that's meant to be is a quantitative analysis of the status of marine habitat and biodiversity protection. There's been a little bit of discussion about whether this is sort of an inventory or whether it's a gap analysis. And the major difference between those is that a gap analysis assumes that we know what the values of the society are and what the society wants. And unfortunately, we're humble enough to know that we don't know that. And that this is an iterative process, and the work that's being done here, even this gap analysis, is making some assumptions about those values, and is really meant to be the first step. This is a first step or a step in the process of better understanding our protected area network and where it can go from here. So with that, we can go to the next slide. There are essentially two, just to put this more broadly, two main questions that we're looking at. Where and to what extent do the marine habitats and components of biodiversity and protected areas overlap in U.S. waters? And that does give away, again, the scope of this. We are talking about all U.S. waters, which is pretty intimidating, but that is the intent. And then, again, what gaps exist within the current protection. And those gaps, we're really thinking about it from an ecological perspective. Chris, at the beginning of this webinar, indicated that there are ecological gaps and there are management gaps. At this point, we are trying to stay away from subjective or any really interpretation of the levels of protection that are offered to different habitats in terms of what the different management measures might provide. So we're looking more at an inventory of just what's in the various types of management measures. We can go on to the next slide, which I believe is the last one on this. So the details on this is that the actual analysis will be led by the Duke University Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab. The working group will consist of about 10 people, I believe we're thinking at this point in time. Some of those will be from members from working group 1 to provide some continuity, but that will be augmented by folks, like I said, outside with expertise on spatial analyses and maybe specific data sets that we'll need to bring into the analysis and just general expertise on the subject. Originally, I don't think we've mentioned this, but this entire effort, working group, was meant to be 2 week-long workshops. Obviously, with the current public health outlook, that is not possible at the moment, and we'll see whether it's possible for us to do this analysis over a week-long workshop or whether that will be done remotely. I think we're all getting pretty used to this remote method of communicating. There will be an opportunity for review of the output both by working groups, by both working groups, as well as an opportunity for feedback input from a broader community as well. at which point we will continue writing up the results in a manuscript. And one really exciting element of this for us, like we said at the beginning, is we do want this to make a difference. We are really excited that this project was essentially, the ball got started rolling through requests from Chris at the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation to provide input on what levels of protection exist for biodiversity. And we really want to be able to feedback to managers. We've already had a call with managers of various agencies in the US, and we're very excited about working with LenFest to develop policy briefs and other outreach materials to get this information out as far as possible. And with that, I will hand back to Emmett for the last slide there.
Thanks, Daniel. And it looks like I somehow got this cut off from the bottom, but I just wanted to end with a quote from former President Kennedy, who said that I really don't know why it is that all of us are so committed to the sea, except I think it's because we all came from the sea. And when we go back to the sea, whether it's to sail or to watch it, or perhaps even to fish, we are going back from whence we came, which I think is especially poetic way of saying that we really do depend on the ocean. This is now really finely documented by scientific evidence from various fields, and that's part of why we're doing this, is because we understand that we depend on the ocean, and the organisms are the engine of ocean ecosystems, and so that's where we're coming from. And so thanks all for listening, and I think we have time for some questions. I'll turn it back over to Emily here. There we are.
All right, thank you so much. So so I'm going to quickly share my screen so folks see the ending slide, which reminds folks to, if you want to ask questions, please type them into the Q&A panel, and I will read them from there. And we have about 20 minutes for questions. Okay, let me make sure I'm seeing everything. Okay, I'm making sure I'm actually seeing the Q&A panel. Okay, so the first question that we have is, and I'm not sure, Emmett and Daniel, that you will have an answer to this, but I do want to read it out loud. And to be clear, this project is about assessing marine biodiversity in U.S. waters. But are there any talks about collaborating with the Canadian government to make the Bay of Fundy a conservation area?
Well, Daniel, you want to take that one?
It's definitely beyond the geographic scope of what we're
Oh, Daniel, we can't hear you very well.
You can't hear me very well. Can you hear me better now?
Yep, that's good.
Now we can hear you, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, that's definitely beyond the geographic scope. I mean, obviously the areas are related and connected, but I don't think we can speak to that. There might be people on the call who can. I've seen at least one person from that region, Fred Whiskey's up there, who might be able to feed in some information about that, but I don't think we can answer that question.
Yeah, I'll only add that we definitely have experts, as we mentioned, from various countries, including Canada, on the working group. So we're hoping to at least benefit from their experience.
I just have a question from Sylvia Trust in the chat. Sorry, I was trying to put it in the Q&A, but it's having difficulty. So other people may be having difficulty with the Q&A. If you do, just throw it in the chat.
Oh yeah. So the second question in the Q&A is, has eDNA technology started to improve understanding of ecological connectivity and distribution of biodiversity in the ocean? What role do you expect that technology will play in better informing global, regional, and local biodiversity conservation plans?
Wow, that is definitely one of the holy grail questions, so to speak, as we go forward in biodiversity research. I would say, in answer to the first question, eDNA is certainly proving useful in looking at connectivity, particularly in cases where the you know the way that DNA works for a particular organism is well known, and the habitats are sampled properly. So there's a lot of promise there. There are many wrinkles to work out before it's used very broadly, or I should say for particular questions. But I think this was an answer to the second question. eDNA or metabarcoding more generally, that is, or metagenomics, that is, looking at the genotypes of samples from the environment rather than from individual organisms, is proving that biodiversity is much larger than we might expect from the types of samples that have traditionally been collected. And so there's tremendous interest and, I think, promise in eDNA being a key biodiversity measurement variable as we go forward. There's a lot of work left to do on what questions it can and cannot answer well.
Great, thank you. And another question from the Q&A. What is the plan for using open access data for the spatial gap analysis and ensuring all data are openly accessible and, if possible, standardized?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. Thank you for the question, Abby. You would know the scope of the available data as well as anybody. Yeah, absolutely. First of all, the geographic regions that we're talking about, the scope is huge. And so we really are going to be looking at regional and in some cases global data sets, and then trying to determine what's available on sort of smaller regional or local levels. But we're probably going to be relying on those larger regional data sets, which are generally open access. And I don't think we'll be using any proprietary data for the analyses that we're talking about. And this will actually, we'll come back to this because there's a question about the temporal nature of the analysis, or when we expect to be finished, and that also feeds into this. This project is meant to be completed this year, so we're hoping to have the analysis done by the end of the year. And again, to do that, we're really going to be relying on existing data sets and open access data sets. Yeah.
Cool, thank you guys. And I'm flipping over to the chat now to make sure we capture everything. And we have a question: what is the best way to follow the progress of this work? And I can jump in at first on that and say, to follow the progress of this work, please do let me know that you're interested. Honestly, we are at the point where we're sharing initial information about the work. The work is getting going right now. And we intend to organize other outreach events and meetings based on what we hear from people. So we kind of plan that as we go based on what will be most useful and interesting. So feel free to reach out to me on following the progress. And I will also let Emmett or Daniel say anything more about that.
I think you've captured it, Emily. We certainly are planning to work with Lenfest on outreach in various formats. We want people to know about this and to give us feedback.
Great, thanks. And then we have another question in the chat. How expansively will you define protections, as in specific threats beyond just fishing, such as shipping and other industrial uses? And to what extent will you look at protected areas and estuaries, which are vulnerable to indirect threats?
I can jump in here, but knowing Emmett's expertise will help you decide as to whether or not we'll be focused on estuaries. Given that he is a seagrass ecologist, I suspect it would be impossible for us to remove those areas from this analysis. So definitely on the estuary side. And with respect to how we define protections, I mean, I think what we're looking at is areas that have been designated by the government, right? So we're not determining based on threat status areas that should be protected. We're looking at things that currently have some level of designation by the government, and then trying to take an inventory of what's in those areas.
Yes, and as Daniel mentioned in a previous comment, given the time frame especially, we're going to really have to rely a lot on publicly available and easily accessible data. And some of that is from estuaries. Estuaries are really where humans are concentrated. And so to the extent that we have protected areas in estuaries and nearshore zones, those will certainly be key parts of our work.
Cool, thank you. We have another question here going back over to the Q&A. Are you hoping to use this research to contribute to the 30 by 30 mission?
Well, I would reiterate here that our goal is to provide the data and the information and framework and interpretation that will allow planning of new and existing protected areas or management of that network. So in that sense, we are officially agnostic to contributing to that, but needless to say, the whole point of doing this kind of work is for better and more effective and sustainable protection. And so in that sense, I think, on a personal level, I would certainly like to see this contribute that way.
Yeah, and I think it was probably informative to hear Chris's introduction and talking about how this information is relevant for expanding the current system of areas under some level of protection in the U.S. So I think that concept was sort of contained within her original question. So that would necessarily feed up into any efforts at achieving 30 by 30.
Cool, thank you. And we have another question. This is an impressive amount of analysis. In what form will you present the results, and how will the results be shared? Do you have a goal date for presenting results?
Well, the project is intended to be completed by the end of this calendar year, which is seeming closer all the time. And so that answers the question about the goal date. I mean, could very well be some months after that before we have the final products completed. But in general, I would say, we plan to publish the results in the peer-reviewed literature, preferably open access. And but also, again, given that the data are likely to be largely open access, we expect that the products from those synthesized products of those data, I would think would also be open access. Daniel, anything to add to that?
No, I agree with all of that
Cool. So we have another question here. The concept of dynamic ocean management addresses how to monitor and manage biodiversity in environments where oceanography and species distributions are highly variable in space and time. Will the project consider existing or prospective DOM efforts or dynamic ocean management efforts?
That one's definitely got you written on it, Daniel.
Yeah, this is one that's close to my heart, and it's a great question. All of the efforts towards dynamic ocean management within the U.S. Have been sectoral efforts, right? They're fisheries. There's at least one example of trying to work with shipping lanes in a dynamic manner. They are not sort of nationally designated cross-sectoral measures. So I think we are very interested in this question. I don't know that any of those designations would fall within the scope of the designations we're currently thinking about looking at. But it's definitely one to keep on the list and to try to think about how we're going to address not just dynamic ocean management, but those sectoral, the protection offered by sectoral management measures.
Awesome, thank you. We have another question. How do you envisage to account for species for which there is not enough spatial data or only point data?
It's another great question. Yeah, it's in terms of running prioritization efforts, those species where you only have a single point is impossible to incorporate into any type of prioritization because you just end up selecting those particular areas every single time. So you can't, in the same way, it's extraordinarily difficult to think about a gap analysis where you're trying to make sure you've got each of those species where there's only a single point. This happens a lot of time in conservation planning, right? Where you have a rare species that the last sighting was in 1956. And what do you do with that single point? So I think right now the general idea is that there are going to be charismatic species, which are generally a focus of conservation efforts, which we'll be able to include because we have enough data or models to include them. And then where we don't, generally the idea is to move to proxies of biodiversity in general.
Great, thank you. And another question, are you going to account for the historical distribution of species or the recent distribution / recent records in your gap analysis? Obviously, if data are available.
This is probably most appropriate for Daniel too, but I'll give him a break. So, you know, I think that the answer is actually related to Daniel's answer to the last question, which is you know, that oftentimes the historical data will be even spottier than current data. And so, you know, without a really strong reason, and sometimes there are strong reasons for, you know, looking into the historic occurrence of species, I think we'll most likely be restricted to relatively current data. And, you know, even within that constraint, the data will have been collected at various different times, you know, over the course of years. So most likely the data that we use will primarily be relatively recent. I don't know, Daniel, is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think actually what we've been thinking of more is the sort of rapid recent changes that are going on, such that the data that you have for the last decade might not actually be useful for the next decade. And in that case, we have spent a fair amount of time and thought trying to make sure we have experts within our group that are focused on things like climate velocity and climate trajectory and how we can incorporate those to make sure that we are not just assessing gaps currently, but gaps in the near future as species move. I guess I can add one more thing to that. I do think it's a really good question in terms of thinking about restoration efforts and trying to restore species ranges to places where they used to be, but where we're currently not seeing them. That restoration is not necessarily been an objective of this gap analysis, but I think it is a really good point to raise as to how we envisage this complementing or feeding into any thoughts about areas to be restored.
Great, thank you so much. And we got a couple more questions here. Curious if there will be a complementary effort to map the footprint of ocean uses that could help assess potential threats to biodiversity. And obviously, you know, we at LenFest are not funding a complementary effort, but I wonder, Emmett and Daniel, if you want to speak to how impacts from ocean uses will, you know, interact with how you assess biodiversity in this project.
I can jump in again, and Emmett can correct me. He's the federal employee, I'm not, so there's probably differences in how we are allowed to answer these questions, or a federally affiliated employee. So the first answer is as Emily indicated, is that it's not part of this project. There are other projects ongoing, work that NCEES does to map the footprint of human uses of the ocean, I think, that are extremely relevant to this. I think what we're trying very hard to do is to feed information in on the biodiversity side that would then be incorporated down the line through more appropriate means of stakeholder engagements to decide how you want to put those together with human uses to determine potential next steps for the MPA network in the US. We are not going to do that. We are not trying to determine which are the best places that you next need to choose. We're trying to identify gaps in the current coverage, and then it will be up to, like I said, a more stakeholder-driven process to take a look at the threats and the costs related to those areas and determine where they might want to go.
Great, thank you. And we have one last question before we close out this evening or morning or late afternoon, whenever you're joining. How will cultural heritage and its intersection with natural heritage be addressed in the gap analysis, if at all? Will culturally valuable species be prioritized for protection in any way?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and important question, and I think it you know, the answer is similar to Daniel's answer to the last question, which is, you know, the prioritization for conservation is, again, a stakeholder-driven process that you know, is based on the values of the different stakeholders. You know, our goal here is to show where the species are and are not protected, and what kinds of you know, habitats are protected and so on. So the way I would look at that is, I hope that the products of this work make it possible to more effectively protect cultural heritage in an evidence-based way.
Great, thank you so much. Daniel, do you have anything to add before I wrap it up?
No, just a huge thank you to everybody for joining and for staying on to the end here, and for your questions. They're really good questions, and they also help us to think about directions for this. As was said early on, but it's good for us to repeat, this is really kind of a launch for this project. We've had about a month's worth of discussions, 3 or 4 discussions with the working group, and we're just sort of getting down into the weeds of things now. So it's really helpful to get this kind of feedback through these questions and comments to help guide our internal discussions. And we would highly encourage you to reach out to us with further thoughts and questions and comments about directions. Thank you very much.
Likewise.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say I second that, and it's gratifying to see that there's a lot of interest in this. And thanks everyone for joining us and for your questions. As Daniel said, they're going to be important in helping us get through and get to a good product in the end.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, and stay in touch. Reach out if you have thoughts or questions to share. Otherwise, that's all we have for this evening, and we will be in touch around different engagement opportunities we have going forward. So thank you so much.